My name is Annabelle. I am 24 years old, and I have recently learned that blood is just a biological coincidence, not a binding contract. After 10 grueling weeks of basic training, 10 weeks of inhaling dust, breaking my own physical boundaries, and stripping away every piece of weakness I had ever carried, the day had finally come. Graduation day. The bleachers were a sea of chaotic, overwhelming pride. Thousands of families were shaking the grandstands, screaming the names of the soldiers standing in perfect formation. But as I stared straight ahead, keeping my bearing flawless, my eyes locked onto two very specific, glaringly empty aluminum seats in row G. My family wasn't there. I didn't have a family. I only had strangers who happened to share my last name. Because for them, sipping complimentary champagne at my older sister's bridal boutique appointment was infinitely more important than witnessing the greatest achievement of my life. I didn't break formation, and I didn't shed a tear. The military had taught me how to compartmentalize pain, but my family had been teaching me how to be invisible for 2 decades. 3 weeks later, the bill for their negligence came due. My father sent me a casual text message asking for an $8,000 loan to cover a minor gap in that very same wedding budget. He assumed I was still the quiet, compliant girl who would drain her hard-earned military savings to keep the family peace. I felt absolutely zero anger. The emotional center of my brain was perfectly still. I opened my banking app, typed the number 8, added a decimal, and hit transfer. I sent him exactly $8 with a note that simply read, "Best wishes." Then I picked up the phone, called my husband, and told him to change every single lock on our house permanently. Before I take you into the cold calculations behind those fake diamonds and the moment my father tried to break into my house with a useless key only to bring the police down on himself, subscribe to the channel. This isn't just a story, it's an audit of a broken family. Stay with me. The sun over the parade field that morning was merciless. It beat down on the heavy fabric of my dress uniform, baking the starch into my collar until it felt like a razor against my neck. We had been standing at attention for what felt like hours, our boots planted firmly in the gravel, our chins angled precisely parallel to the ground. The air smelled of brass polish, boot leather, and the collective sweat of hundreds of recruits who had finally crossed the finish line. Around me, the air was vibrating with the sheer volume of human emotion. To my left, Private Miller's mother was sobbing so loudly I could hear her over the marching band. To my right, someone's father was waving a massive, hand-painted sign. But my gaze was fixed on a geometric sliver of the stands just above the middle walkway. Row G, seats 14 and 15. The sun reflected off the bare, silver metal of those two chairs, making them shine like a beacon of abandonment. They were the only empty seats in the entire section. I focused on the heat radiating from that metal. I let the visual of those empty chairs burn itself into my retinas. I didn't feel the familiar, childhood sting of rejection. Instead, I felt a strange, cold clarity settling into my bones. For years, I had been the low-maintenance child, the one who solved her own math problems, cooked her own dinners when they worked late, and quietly joined the military to secure her own future so they wouldn't have to pay for college. Chloe, on the other hand, required a symphony of attention just to wake up in the morning. She was the golden child, a walking crisis who demanded constant financial and emotional bailouts. Standing there in the blistering heat, feeling the weight of the rifle in my hands, I finally understood that my independence hadn't earned their respect. It had only bought my obsolescence. When the ceremony finally broke and the command of "dismissed" echoed across the field, the crowd surged forward like a dam breaking. Families collided with soldiers in a messy, tearful tangle of hugs and flash photography. I turned on my heel and walked in the opposite direction. The gravel crunched steadily beneath my boots. Every step was measured, deliberate, and entirely solitary. The locker room was dim and smelled faintly of floor wax and damp towels. The silence in there was heavy, a stark contrast to the celebration roaring outside. I walked over to my locker, dialed the combination with practiced precision, and pulled open the heavy metal door. My civilian phone sat on the top shelf, dead and silent. I held the power button down, watching the little white logo illuminate the screen, casting a pale glow over my face in the shadows of the room. It took 30 seconds for the network to connect. When it did, a single message notification popped onto the screen. It was from Robert, my father. I didn't open it immediately. I let it sit there, analyzing the digital footprint of his guilt. When I finally swiped to read it, the words were a masterpiece of careless manipulation. Chloe's veil selection took longer than expected, and the interstate traffic is completely jammed. We won't make it. We're proud of you, kiddo. Send pictures when you can. I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the glass. There was no apology. No mention of turning around or trying to catch the end of the ceremony. Just a casual dismissal, dressed up with a hollow compliment and a demand for me to provide them with a souvenir of the moment they chose to miss. I noticed the lack of punctuation at the end of the first sentence. He had typed it quickly. He had probably texted me with one hand while holding a crystal flute of champagne in the other, nodding along as Chloe debated the merits of French lace versus Italian silk. I locked the screen. The glass went black, reflecting my own stoic expression back at me. I didn't type a reply. I didn't send a picture. I slowly unbuttoned the stiff collar of my uniform, feeling the cool air hit my skin. I began to fold the fabric, aligning the creases with military precision. As I smoothed my hands over the dark material, an absolute, freezing calm washed over my mind. The Annabelle who craved their approval had officially died on that parade field, buried under the weight of their absence. I was walking away cleanly, or so I thought. I had left the emotional debt of my family on that metal bleacher, but as I closed my locker that day, I didn't yet know that the real, tangible bill for their audacity was going to arrive 3 weeks later. The transition from a military barracks to the quiet sanctuary of my own home was a physical shock to my nervous system. For my first 3 weeks as a civilian, I spent hours just marveling at the autonomy of it all. There were no sudden sirens, no barking drill sergeants, no communal showers that smelled of bleach and athlete's foot. There was only the low, steady hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the smell of fresh cedar from the hardwood floors my husband and I had just polished. Our house was a modest, single-story build in a quiet suburb, but to me, it was a fortress. It was a physical manifestation of everything I had built with my own 2 hands. I would wake up at 6 in the morning, not because a bugle forced me to, but because I wanted to sit on my back porch in absolute silence, feeling the smooth, glazed ceramic of my coffee mug warming my palms. I was carefully unspooling the tension from my muscles, letting the bruises fade, and finally, allowing myself to breathe. Then came a Tuesday afternoon. The vibration of my phone against the kitchen island sounded like a rattlesnake in an otherwise empty room. I remember the exact slant of the afternoon sun slicing through the faux wood blinds, painting horizontal stripes of pale light across the granite countertops. I was halfway through sorting a stack of mail when the screen illuminated. It was a text message from Robert, my father. I set down a utility bill and picked up the device. The glass of the screen was cool against my thumb. I didn't feel a sudden spike of anxiety, nor did my heart rate accelerate. The military had trained me to face incoming fire with a slow, measured breath, and my father's communication was simply another form of incoming fire. I tapped the notification and let his words fill the screen. It was a long block of text, devoid of any genuine greeting or inquiry about my well-being. "Annie, we have a situation," the message began, immediately deploying his favorite tactic, manufacturing a collective crisis. Chloe's venue requires the final deposit by Friday, and the floral vendor just informed us about a massive upcharge for the imported orchids she selected. We're looking at a critical shortfall. I know you just got back with a solid chunk of savings from your deployment and training pay. We need $8,000 to cover the gap. It's on us to keep this family together right now and make sure your sister's day isn't ruined. Let me know when you wire it. I didn't blink. I simply read the words again, dissecting the anatomy of his audacity. He didn't ask if I had the money to spare. He didn't ask if my husband and I had our own mortgage to pay or groceries to buy or a life to build. He had simply calculated my suffering, converted my sweat into a currency, and earmarked it for his favorite daughter's perishable floral arrangements. $8,000. In his world, that was a minor gap in a wedding budget. A few extra tables draped in imported linens, a towering cake, a photographer to capture moments of a family that only existed for the cameras. In my world, $8,000 was the exact sum of my accumulated basic training pay. It was the price of blistered heels, fractured sleep, and carrying a 60-pound rucksack through miles of freezing mud. It was the financial equivalent of my physical endurance. And he felt entirely entitled to it. He truly saw me as nothing more than the family's emergency glass. Break in case of financial shortfall. I was the invisible daughter when it came to celebration, but the designated ATM when their own reckless vanity brought them to the brink of embarrassment. The phrase, "It's on us to keep this family together," echoed in my mind. It was a sickening, manipulative attempt to weaponize my sense of duty, a duty they had never reciprocated. I walked over to one of the bar stools and sat down slowly, resting my elbows on the cool granite. I looked at the kitchen window, watching a stray leaf drift across the lawn. The emotional center of my brain was a frozen lake. There was no grief left to feel. I had exhausted my supply of tears on the bleachers 3 weeks ago. Now, there was only the cold, mechanical precision of a soldier assessing a perimeter breach. I closed the messaging application. My thumb hovered over the screen for a fraction of a second before pressing the icon for my bank. The biometric scanner scanned my face, authorizing my entry into the vault of my independence. The screen flashed blue, loading my account balances. I navigated to the transfer menu with deliberate, unhurried taps. Add recipient. I typed in my father's name and his banking routing information, which I had saved years ago when I used to send them money to help with my mother's old medical bills. Enter amount. The cursor blinked steadily on the crisp white background, waiting for a command. My father had requested $8,000. He had demanded a sacrifice of my blood and sweat to buy silence and pretty pictures. I placed my thumb over the numeric keypad. I didn't type 8,000. I didn't draft a long, emotional paragraph about my feelings of neglect. I didn't prepare a speech about how they had abandoned me on my graduation day. Instead, I watched the cursor blink one last time. And then I pressed a single digit. I pressed the number 8. I didn't add the 3 zeros he was expecting. I just tapped the decimal point, followed by 2 more zeros. $8.00. The screen prompted me for a memo. My fingers moved over the digital keyboard with the steady, rhythmic precision of a metronome. Best wishes. I tapped the blue confirmation button. The app loaded for a fraction of a second, the little circular icon spinning before a bright green checkmark illuminated the screen. Transfer complete. I set the phone face down on the granite countertop. The kitchen was utterly silent, save for the low, steady hum of the refrigerator compressor kicking on and the faint rattle of the ice maker. I didn't feel the adrenaline rush that usually accompanies a confrontation. My heart rate hadn't spiked. My palms were completely dry against the smooth stone. In the military, they teach you that panic is a luxury you cannot afford when the perimeter is breached. You don't scream at the enemy. You don't ask them why they are attacking. You fortify the wall. My father had an old spare key to this house. He had insisted on having it for emergencies when my husband and I first moved in. To Robert, an emergency wasn't a house fire or a medical crisis. It was a sudden whim, a need to drop off a box of unwanted items, or, as I fully anticipated now, the absolute necessity to demand an explanation in person when he realized he had been denied his $8,000 bailout. His pride would not allow him to accept a rejection via a banking app notification. He would come here to assert his dominance. I didn't call him to argue. I didn't text Chloe to ruin her floral arrangements or demand she pay for her own imported orchids. I simply opened the browser on my phone, bypassed the emotional fallout entirely, and searched for a local emergency locksmith. Within 45 minutes, a heavy white commercial van idled in my driveway. The technician, a burly man with grease permanently stained into the deep creases of his knuckles, walked up to the front porch carrying a heavy canvas tool bag. The metallic clinking of his wrenches, brass cylinders, and drill bits sounded like a symphony of boundaries finally being drawn. Replacing everything? He asked, glancing at the standard builder-grade hardware on the front door. Everything, I replied, my voice flat and completely devoid of urgency. Front door, back patio, the side garage entry. I want high-security deadbolts and a smart lock system for the main entrance. No master keys. No bumped cylinders. Heavy duty. He nodded, sensing the absolute finality in my tone. He didn't ask questions. For the next 2 hours, the quiet afternoon in my house was disrupted only by the harsh, mechanical sounds of extraction. I sat at the kitchen island and watched as he unscrewed the old brass faceplates. The rusted screws shrieked as they were forced out of the dry wood of the door frame. When he pulled the old deadbolt mechanism from the front door, leaving a hollow, circular wound in the white fiberglass, I felt a profound, physical sense of relief. My husband came home just as the technician was installing the final smart lock on the back door. He walked into the kitchen, looked at the pile of discarded, useless brass locks sitting on the counter, and then looked at me. I handed him a glass of ice water. I didn't need to give him a hysterical breakdown or a tearful explanation. I just calmly told him about the text message, the $8 transfer, and the impending fallout. He took a long, slow sip of his water, set the glass down on a coaster, and simply nodded. He understood. He had watched the slow, agonizing erosion of my patience for years. He knew this wasn't an act of revenge. It was an act of quarantine. If you are watching this, and you've ever found a message on your phone that showed you exactly who your family really is, hit that subscribe button. Because this story is about what happens when you stop crying and start auditing. Keep watching. The new hardware was matte black, heavy, and brutally modern. The technician handed me the master control panel and walked me through the application syncing process. I watched the little battery icon turn green on my phone screen. With a single tap of my thumb, the heavy steel bolt slid into the reinforced door frame with a loud, authoritative thud. It was the sound of a vault sealing shut. I walked the perimeter of the house slowly. I tested the side door, pulling hard on the handle with both hands. It didn't yield a single millimeter. I checked the garage keypad, wiping the factory default codes and replacing them with a complex alphanumeric sequence that didn't include a single birthday, anniversary, or predictable number associated with my biological relatives. Next, I activated the exterior security cameras. I stood in the dimming light of the living room, watching the live feed on my tablet. The wide-angle lens captured the entire driveway, the street, and the porch with crystal clarity. I adjusted the motion sensor sensitivity, dragging a digital red box around the exact boundary of my property line. Anyone who stepped a foot onto the concrete walkway would instantly trigger a silent push alert to my phone. The sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, sharp shadows across the manicured lawns of our neighborhood. The house grew dark, but I didn't reach for the switch to turn on the overhead lights. I sat on the sofa, the faint blue glow of the tablet reflecting in my eyes, watching the empty porch. Somewhere across town, Robert was likely checking his banking app. He was likely staring at the single digit and the 2 zeros, the initial confusion slowly curdling into a toxic, entitled indignation. And in his pocket, resting against his loose change, was a brass key that was now nothing more than a jagged, utterly useless piece of scrap metal. The perimeter was secure. All that was left to do was wait for the trespasser. It was less than 48 hours later when the perimeter was finally tested. A Thursday afternoon, roughly 2 o'clock. The neighborhood was submerged in that specific kind of aggressively peaceful suburban silence, the kind where the only audible sounds were the distant hum of a lawnmower and the occasional chirp of a blue jay. Inside the house, the atmosphere was a perfect, temperature-controlled 68 degrees. My husband was sitting at the kitchen island, his reading glasses perched on the bridge of his nose as he scrolled through a spreadsheet on his laptop. The smell of freshly ground espresso beans hung heavy and rich in the air. I was standing by the sink, slowly running a linen towel over the rim of a washed ceramic mug when the security tablet mounted on the wall emitted a soft, dual-tone chime. I didn't flinch. I didn't gasp. I simply draped the towel over the edge of the sink and took the 3 deliberate steps to the glowing screen. The high-definition camera feed buffered for a fraction of a second before displaying a crystal-clear, wide-angle view of our driveway. There, idling aggressively on the freshly poured concrete, was Robert's slate gray sedan. The driver's side door swung open, and my father stepped out into the afternoon sun. He was wearing a pastel yellow golf polo tucked neatly into khaki slacks, an outfit that suggested he had interrupted his leisure schedule specifically to deal with a sudden, annoying logistical error, which, in his mind, was exactly what I was. I tapped the screen once, expanding the video feed to fill the entire tablet. My husband didn't ask who it was. He simply closed his laptop with a soft click and walked over to stand behind my left shoulder. His presence was a quiet anchor, a steady mass of solidarity that required no dialogue. Through the digital eye of the camera, I watched Robert march up the front walkway. His posture was rigid with a familiar, toxic blend of paternal authority and deeply offended pride. He didn't bother to press the doorbell. People who believe they own you never ask for permission to enter your space. Instead, he reached into the pocket of his slacks and pulled out a heavy silver keyring. He selected a worn, brass key, the old spare I had handed him 3 years ago in a moment of misplaced filial trust, and thrust it toward the door handle. For a long, fascinating moment, I watched the cognitive dissonance wash over his face in real time. The camera captured every micro-expression as he stared at the new, matte black steel plate of the smart lock. There was no traditional keyhole where he expected one to be. There was only a sleek, dark glass keypad that offered him absolutely zero leverage. He tried to jam the old brass key into the small emergency override slot at the bottom, but the grooved patterns didn't match. The metal scraped uselessly against the hardened steel, producing a faint, pathetic scratching sound that transmitted perfectly through the two-way audio feed. When the mechanical reality finally registered, the confusion on his face rapidly metastasized into pure, unfiltered indignation. He grabbed the heavy handle and yanked it downward, pulling with his entire body weight. The reinforced fiberglass door didn't yield a single millimeter. It stood there, a dumb, inanimate object that was somehow defying the patriarch of the family. Annabelle, his voice crackled through the tablet speaker, distorted by proximity and rage. He balled his hand into a fist and began to pound on the door. Thud, thud, thud. The heavy blows vibrated against the frame, but they felt entirely hollow from where I stood. "I know you're in there," he yelled, his face leaning so close to the doorbell camera that I could see the broken blood vessels on his cheeks. "Open this door right now." "What is this nonsense? $8? You changed the locks on your own father over a misunderstanding." I reached out and muted the audio feed. The sudden silence in the kitchen was exquisite. Through the soundproofed walls of my fortress, his pounding was reduced to a faint, rhythmic tapping, like a woodpecker entirely too far away to matter. I watched his mouth moving on the screen, a silent movie of a man throwing a tantrum because his designated ATM had suddenly grown teeth. When the pounding didn't work, Robert took a step back, panting slightly, his hands resting on his hips. He looked around the quiet, empty street, as if expecting an audience to validate his outrage. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out his smartphone. I watched his thumbs stab violently at the screen. He held the phone to his ear, pacing back and forth across the length of my porch, crushing the fallen magnolia petals under the soles of his expensive leather loafers. His free hand waved wildly in the air as he spoke, pointing an accusatory finger at my front door. He was calling the police. It was a masterclass in narcissistic delusion. He had genuinely convinced himself that his paternal title granted him legal jurisdiction over my property. He was weaponizing the authorities, fully expecting men with badges to arrive, scold the disobedient daughter, and force me to hand over the $8,000 for Chloe's floral arrangements. I turned away from the screen. The emotional detachment I felt was so absolute it was almost clinical. "He called 911, I said quietly, walking past the kitchen island toward the hallway. My husband leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. "Do you want me to talk to them when they get here?" "No," I replied smoothly. "He is my biological mess. I will clean it up." I walked into our home office, the air smelling faintly of old paper and the leather of my desk chair. I knelt on the hardwood floor and spun the dial on the heavy, fireproof safe tucked beneath the bookshelf. The heavy steel door swung open smoothly. I reached into the top compartment and pulled out a thick, manila envelope. Inside was the warranty deed to the house, the mortgage documents, and a copy of my state identification, all bearing my name and my husband's name. Not Robert's. Not Chloe's. I slid the crisp, heavy stock paper from the envelope. Running my thumb over the raised notary seal at the bottom of the page, I felt the undeniable texture of reality. This piece of paper was a legal firewall. It was the boundary line where my childhood ended and his authority turned to ash. As I walked back out to the foyer, clutching the documents against my chest, the faint, wailing sound of sirens began to bleed through the insulated windows. The sound started as a distant, mechanical scream from the main avenue, growing steadily louder, sharper, and more defined as it turned onto our suburban street. I stopped a few feet from the front door. Through the frosted glass panels, I could see the distorted silhouette of my father, pacing like a caged animal, eagerly awaiting his heavily armed customer service representatives. I took a slow, deep breath, not out of fear, but to savor the exact moment before his entire worldview collapsed. I adjusted the collar of my shirt, waited for the rhythmic flash of red and blue lights to paint the walls of my hallway, and reached for the door handle. The strobe of the police cruiser's light bars swept across the walls of my foyer in rhythmic, aggressive strokes of red and blue. It washed over the polished hardwood, temporarily tinting the white baseboards in the colors of an emergency that did not strictly exist. I stood perfectly still, the heavy manila envelope pressed flat against my chest, and listened to the synchronized thud of 2 car doors slamming shut out on the street. My father had ordered a tactical strike based on a misunderstanding of his own making, and the state had obligingly sent 2 uniformed officers to facilitate his tantrum. Through the frosted glass panels of the front door, I watched Robert abruptly abandon his pacing. His posture instantly shifted. The aggressive, entitled patriarch evaporated, replaced immediately by the practiced, slightly helpless stance of a concerned suburban taxpayer. It was a performance I had seen 1,000 times during my childhood, the rapid shedding of accountability the moment an external authority figure entered the room. The heavy footfalls of the officers echoed against the concrete walkway. I could hear the distinct, static hiss of a shoulder-mounted radio and the metallic clink of utility belts. Before they even reached the first step of the porch, Robert launched into his monologue. His voice, previously a booming instrument of rage, was now carefully calibrated to a tone of exasperated, paternal suffering. "Officers, thank you for getting here so quickly," he began, the words bleeding through the insulation of my door. "I'm dealing with a family situation here. My daughter is inside. She's locked me out, changed the hardware, and she's refusing to let me into the house. She's having some sort of episode, I think. I just need to get inside and talk some sense into her." He was weaving a narrative where I was the hysterical, irrational variable, and he was the stabilizing force. He was attempting to deputize the police into forcing my compliance. I placed my hand on the matte black interior handle of the new smart lock. The metal was cool to the touch. I took one final, measured breath, letting the oxygen flood my lungs, slowing my heart rate to a resting, absolute calm. I pushed the handle down. The heavy door swung inward with a soft rush of air, breaking the seal of the house. The late afternoon humidity hit my face instantly, carrying the smell of ozone, cut grass, and the faint, acrid exhaust from the idling police cruisers. I stepped out onto the welcome mat, crossing the threshold into the theater he had constructed. The visual composition of the porch was striking. To my left stood 2 police officers, one a veteran with silver at his temples and deep, cynical lines etched around his eyes, the other younger, his hand resting cautiously on the buckle of his tactical belt. To my right was Robert, frozen mid-sentence, his arms still extended in a gesture of vague, victimized exasperation. "There she is," Robert snapped, the mask slipping just a fraction as the anger flared back into his eyes. "Annabelle, what on earth is wrong with you? Tell these officers to—" I didn't look at him. I didn't turn my head in his direction, nor did I acknowledge the sound of his voice. I effectively erased him from my visual field. The military teaches you how to maintain target fixation amidst chaos, and my target was the veteran officer standing closest to the steps. I walked forward, keeping my movements deliberate, unthreatening, and smooth. I stopped 2 feet from the officers, maintaining a respectful distance. My expression was entirely neutral, wiped clean of any defensive anxiety or reciprocal anger. "Good afternoon, officers," I said. My voice was pitched low, steady, and perfectly even. It was the voice of a professional delivering a status report. "I apologize that your time is being wasted on a civil matter. I am the sole owner of this property." I unclasped the manila envelope and slid out the documents. The crisp, heavy stock paper crackled sharply in the quiet afternoon air. I extended my hand, offering the papers to the older officer. "This is the warranty deed to the house, along with my state-issued identification and my husband's identification," I continued, holding his gaze. "The man standing behind you is my biological father. He does not reside at this address. He has never resided at this address. He is not on the mortgage, nor does he possess any legal claim to this property. He arrived uninvited and attempted to bypass a newly installed security system with an old, revoked spare key." The older officer took the documents. He didn't speak. He simply adjusted his stance, lowering his chin to study the papers in the bright sunlight. The younger officer shifted his weight, his eyes darting between my calm, immobile posture and Robert's increasingly erratic energy. "Now wait just a minute," Robert sputtered, taking a step toward the center of the porch. His voice was rising in pitch, the panic of losing control bleeding through the veneer. "I am her father. I helped her move into this place. You can't just— she owes me money. This is a family dispute. She's just acting out because of a financial arrangement we have." "Sir," the younger officer said, his voice carrying the sharp, flat edge of practiced authority. "Step back. Keep your voice down." I watched the older officer's eyes track across the black ink of the deed. He checked the name, compared it to my driver's license, and then looked at the date of birth. He spent perhaps 30 seconds examining the undeniable, legal reality of the situation. 30 seconds of excruciating, absolute silence on the porch, save for the hum of the cruisers in the street. Slowly, the officer folded the documents and handed them back to me. He met my eyes, and I saw a flicker of professional respect, a silent acknowledgement that he understood exactly what kind of dynamic he had walked into. I wasn't a victim, and I wasn't a hysterical child throwing a tantrum. I was a property owner executing a boundary. "Thank you, ma'am," the officer said quietly. Then he pivoted on his heel, turning his entire body to face Robert. The shift in the physical space was immediate and devastating. The officers were no longer a neutral third party. They were a physical wall between me and the man who thought he owned me. "Mr. Robert," the veteran officer said, his tone entirely devoid of the polite deference he had shown me a minute ago. "I've reviewed the documentation. This is not your property." "But I'm her father," Robert protested, his hands gesturing wildly, the pastel yellow polo suddenly looking less like leisure attire and more like a costume he had outgrown. "You can't be serious. I have a right to speak to my daughter." "You have no rights on this property, sir." The officer cut him off, his voice dropping an octave, turning hard and cold. "The homeowner has made it clear that you are not welcome here. Your biological relationship is legally irrelevant. You are currently trespassing." I stood perfectly still, watching the architecture of my father's ego collapse in real time. The blood drained from his face, leaving a sickly, pale hue beneath his weekend tan. He looked from the officer to me, searching for a trace of the obedient, terrified girl he had raised. He found nothing but a blank, unyielding stare. I didn't offer him a smirk of victory or a scowl of hatred. I offered him nothing. "If you do not return to your vehicle and vacate this street immediately," the officer continued, placing his thumb casually near the clasp of his radio, "you will be placed in handcuffs, transported to the precinct, and formally charged with criminal trespassing and disturbing the peace. Do we have an understanding?" It was the most beautiful sentence I had ever heard. It wasn't screamed or yelled. It was stated with the cold, bureaucratic finality of the law. Robert's mouth opened and closed silently. The illusion of his omnipotence had just been shattered by a man with a badge and a piece of paper. He had bet everything on the assumption that my boundaries were a bluff, only to discover they were reinforced steel. He looked at me one last time. There was no apology in his eyes, only the toxic, bitter realization of his own defeat. He didn't say another word. He turned around, his shoulders slumped beneath his expensive shirt, and walked heavily down the concrete path toward his slate-gray sedan. The officers stood on my porch, watching him like hawks until the car engine roared to life and he aggressively reversed out of my driveway, speeding off down the suburban street. The older officer turned back to me, touching the brim of his hat in a brief, respectful salute. "Have a quiet evening, ma'am." "Thank you, officers." "Drive safe," I replied smoothly. I stepped back inside and pulled the heavy door shut. The deadbolt engaged with a satisfying, electronic click. I stood in the cool air of my foyer, clutching the warranty deed to my chest, and for the first time in my 24 years of life, the house was truly, completely silent. The following Saturday arrived with the quiet, unremarkable grace of a day that belonged entirely to me. It was the third weekend of the month, the exact date circled heavily in red ink on my father's calendar and presumably engraved in gold foil on heavy cardstock invitations scattered across town. It was Chloe's wedding day. In the weeks leading up to this afternoon, I had often wondered if the phantom limb of family obligation would ache when the actual moment arrived. I wondered if, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the precise hour she was scheduled to walk down the aisle, I would feel a sudden, involuntary pang of grief. But as I sat on my back patio, watching the late afternoon sun cast long, lazy shadows across the lawn, I felt nothing of the sort. I scanned my own emotional perimeter, searching for a trace of regret, a flicker of guilt, or the familiar, hollow ache of being left out. The scan came back entirely clear. The emotional center of my brain was as still and unbothered as the surface of a frozen lake. The house behind me was a fortress of tranquility. The heavy, matte black smart locks on the doors stood as silent sentinels, physically embodying the boundaries I had drawn in the sand. Inside, the rhythmic, steady chop, chop, chop of a chef's knife against a bamboo cutting board echoed from the kitchen. My husband was preparing dinner. The rich, savory aroma of roasting garlic and rosemary began to drift out through the open patio door, mingling with the scent of the cedar decking. There were no frantic phone calls about missing caterers. There were no passive-aggressive sighs, no manufactured emergencies, and absolutely no demands for my financial intervention. I leaned back in the patio chair, allowing my mind to wander, just for a moment, to the chaotic symphony I knew was playing out exactly 14 miles away. I pictured the venue, draped in whatever expensive fabrics Chloe had deemed essential for her aesthetic survival. I imagined the imported orchids, the ones that had allegedly triggered an $8,000 deficit. By now, they were likely already beginning to wilt under the heat of the camera lighting, their delicate, overpriced petals drooping in a display of fragile vanity. I pictured Robert, sweating inside a rented tuxedo that was slightly too tight around his collar, circulating among the guests with a practiced, politician smile. I knew exactly how he was spinning my absence to the extended family. He was likely leaning in close, adopting a tone of solemn, paternal tragedy, whispering about how the military had hardened me, how I had grown distant, how he was simply heartbroken but determined to focus on his good girl today. He was using my silence to buy himself sympathy, but for the first time in my 24 years of life, I didn't care about the narrative he was constructing. He could paint me as the villain in his story for the rest of his natural life, as long as he did it from the outside of my locked doors. I stood up from the patio chair and walked back inside, sliding the glass door shut behind me. The cool, climate-controlled air of the living room rushed over my skin. I walked over to the kitchen island, where my smartphone sat face down on the cool granite surface. It looked like a defused bomb, an object that used to hold the power to shatter my peace with a single notification, now rendered completely inert. I picked it up and tapped the screen. The lock screen illuminated, showing a clean, empty display. No missed calls. No frantic texts. I swiped down from the top right corner and pressed the small crescent moon icon.
Do not disturb.
The system confirmed the command, effectively severing my digital connection to the outside world. I placed the phone back on the counter, face down. I didn't need to know if the wedding cake collapsed, or if Robert's credit card was declined at the open bar, or if Chloe noticed that the sister she had ignored for a decade wasn't standing in the background of her photographs. My husband slid a ceramic plate across the island. The steak was cooked to a perfect medium rare, resting beside a mound of buttery, roasted asparagus. He poured 2 glasses of a deep, heavy Cabernet, the dark liquid swirling against the crystal. He didn't ask how I was feeling about the wedding. He didn't offer unsolicited platitudes about family. He simply handed me a glass and clinked it gently against mine. To a quiet house, he said, his voice a low, steady anchor in the room. To closed doors, I replied, taking a slow sip. The wine was rich and complex, a sharp contrast to the bitter, metallic taste of obligation I had swallowed for so many years. People like my father and sister operate under the fundamental assumption that shared DNA is an uncancelable subscription. They believe that the title of family grants them an all-access pass to your resources, your patience, and your sanity, regardless of how thoroughly they abuse the privilege. But standing there in my kitchen, feeling the weight of the house keys in my pocket and the absolute safety of my own 4 walls, the truth became crystallized in my mind. Blood is nothing more than a biological footnote. It is an accident of geography and genetics. Respect, however, is a currency. It must be earned, it must be maintained, and when the account is overdrawn, the only logical response is to close it entirely. The military had taught me how to survive in hostile territory, but it was those 2 empty aluminum chairs on graduation day that finally taught me how to leave it. Saying no doesn't always require a screaming match. It doesn't require a dramatic exit, a long, emotional letter, or a public confrontation. Sometimes, the most devastating, earth-shattering boundary you can set is an $8 wire transfer, a changed lock, and a Tuesday evening where you simply refuse to be available. If this reminded you of a room you needed to walk out of, or a lock you needed to change in your own life, share this video, subscribe, and drop a comment below. Sometimes the most powerful ending to a story is just the quiet sound of a locking door. I'll see you in the next one.